This past Wednesday, I made a visit to the VA hospital, the Veterans Administration Hospital in Martinsburg, to see our 89-year-old friend, John Kendall. In visiting with him there, he told me some amazing stories about his life, how he is the oldest of 16 children, 14 of whom survived, including the oldest 5, who are all in their 80s. He served at the end of World War II, dealing with German prisoners and the resettlement of Europe after the end of the war. But more than all of that, he talked about, and with great emotion, about the blessing and the privilege it has been in his life to know the Lord, to work for God, and to serve Him in the context of church ministry. And he talked about places that he had gone and served and worked and with great emotion reflected on the blessing that it was in his life. Now, I've only known John in this last decade or so of his life, but I'll always remember this kind man for being such a weekly blessing and an encouragement to me when I would greet him. And he was that way with everyone who he met around him, a man who just oozes thankfulness from every part of his being. Well, while at the VA hospital, I had to wait for an hour or so for John to return to his room from a test procedure that he was having. And so I went down to the cafeteria. And there were only a few other people, sort of later in the afternoon, only a few other people sitting in the cafeteria, and all of them obviously being served by the medical center in some capacity, and therefore all of them veterans. And so they were doing what veterans do. They were telling war stories, events and things about their lives. Well, why is it that veterans tell stories? And why is it an idiom in the English language that we talk about, we speak of someone who tells stories, sort of, well, they had a lot of war stories to tell. Why has that become an idiom of the language? And it's because folks like veterans or someone who's been through something intense has a common intense adventure in life, something that's bigger than themselves, something that's marked them and their life forever. And I would submit that in the Christian life, we have something very similar to that in the experience that we have in the salvation that we find in Christ and being essentially a part of the war, of warfare. The Bible outright says that we are agents of the Lord and serving Him in the kingdom of light, in the cosmic battle against the kingdom of darkness. And we do this with others in the church family as fellow soldiers of Christ. And over time, we have in our lives then a list of experiences, many of which are very intense and mark our lives forever. We have happy memories of victories won, of people who we have seen and been a part of who have come to know Christ, the Savior, and seen their lives changed, people who have grown up into the scriptures and are serving Him. But then also, if you're around for very long in the ministry of the church, you'll also have a few war stories that are sad ones, of memories of people who were honestly lost in the fight, who often essentially helped out the other side by not following orders and not being part of the disciplines that constitute the Christian life as a good soldier in the kingdom of light. And the Apostle Paul had many of these mixed experiences with people. Timothy and Titus, his main guys serving in Ephesus and Crete, also had experienced many of these highs and lows, both in service with him and then being sent by him to serve in these congregations and cities. They knew about these kinds of experiences in these discipleship ventures, and they too had their own individual theaters of the war where they would see certainly victories, but some losses along the way as well, even from people who would sadly turn out ultimately to be honestly combatants for the other side. Today we continue with the second of 7 weeks, talking in this series we call Nuts and Bolts. We're talking about the nuts and bolts of ministry, the stuff that holds ministries together. And our studies over these weeks come from the letters that Paul wrote to his younger ministry associates, Timothy and Titus, who we talked about last week as serving in Ephesus, Timothy in Ephesus and Titus in Crete. And there are timeless lessons for us in these writings that we call the pastoral epistles, lessons that have guided the Church of Jesus Christ over the last 2 millennia. Now, last week, we talked about these two characters, Timothy and Titus. And this week, we talk on the theme of the characters Timothy and Titus had to work with, characters that make up the church. And next week, picking up on the same word, we'll talk about the character that it takes to be successfully involved in leadership and high-level service in the local church community. But today, we're talking about characters. Yes, the church is full of characters. You know what I'm saying? You're one of them, I'm one of them, right? We're all characters, but it's not like the world isn't full of characters, right? I mean, just, look at the news right now. There's some real characters out there, aren't there, in the world? But Paul wrote to the Corinthians that the church being those who are called out by Christ, called out of the world, that the church does not, he said to the Corinthians, consist of those who were called to this out of high-level capacity strata of life. They're not the high rollers of the world, but rather the simple folk who have been called to grace in the large part, people like you and me, and all the other characters that make up a church. And all of us as a bunch of characters together need to learn to work and serve together in what is in every way a diverse community of faith by God's design and plan and intent. There really are two primary categories of characters that I want to talk about today. Those categories would be, first of all, those who are an obstacle to progress in the church. And then secondly, those who are a blessing toward the advance of the church and of God's kingdom. And then finally, thirdly, today to ask, what kind of character are you? What kind of character do you want to be? Now, I chose this topic because it really struck me in reading through these pastoral epistles that there are so many varied names that Paul uses here and there scattered all throughout, often even in some of the final verses and greetings and so on, and remember this person and that person and so on. So they're scattered throughout these writings. These are mutual acquaintances, as Paul is writing to Timothy and Titus. Paul reflecting on the lives of many of these mutual acquaintances, many of them reflecting on their lives with real joy and gratitude, though others with sadness and even with some words of warning about some that they had experienced along the way who had sadly turned and were now really working for the other kingdom. So we're going to bounce around a bit today in the scriptures in 2 Timothy and Titus. Maybe a little hard for you to follow along. You can give it a shot. I'll have all the scriptures for you here on the wall if it gets confusing. But first, let's talk about that first category, the first type of characters. Characters who prove to be an obstacle to the progress of the church. We'll look at them in 3 categories. The first category of obstacle person was one who was deserting the cause when the going got tough. It mentions a couple of guys here, Phygelus and Hermogenes, and Paul mentions everyone at his trial. Of course, Paul is writing prison epistles here, prison epistle here in 2 Timothy at least. And it says 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15. He says, "You know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, including Phygelus and Hermogenes." Now, we don't know who these men were, other than this reference. This is the only reference to them in the New Testament. But apparently Timothy knew exactly who they were. Paul didn't need to explain who they were. They may have been well-known church leaders who were scattered somewhere around the rest of the ancient world in the early church. But when things got tough, they seemed to be absent and hiding. The same way maybe that the disciples at the trials of Christ kind of were nowhere to be seen, save for Peter, who was nearby but denying knowing Christ. So these are guys who had served in some way and were pretty much absent when the going got tough. Also in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16, he references this again. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. Again, now Paul is writing from an imprisonment here in 2 Timothy, writing near the end of his life, awaiting what will be ultimately a Roman execution. We see in the passage that only Luke is still with him at this time, and maybe Luke arrived too late to be of help. Those who could help, maybe in some way, they were afraid and could not be found. Now, if we look on to the next verses coming up here, this verse 17, it says, "But the Lord stood by my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth." So it sounds like he's been released. So that makes us think that he's referencing the first time that he was in prison and from which he got released. Some people believe that. Probably more people believe, though, that what Paul is talking about here, at my first defense, which he said in verse 16, no one came to support him. This is sort of like the preliminary hearing of his second imprisonment. No one came to support him, and he was waiting then further hearings and so on. But in any event, Paul looked around, and there weren't a lot of people there supporting him. But he says in verse 18, "The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen." Paul says in here that he's not alone, that God is with him. Paul recognized, as you know from other writings, where he said that the worst thing that could happen to him would really be the best thing. I mean, if he lost his life, he would be with the Lord, which he said would be gain, because he would be safely home. So the first category of characters that were an obstacle to progress at church were those who disappeared when the going got tough. And it's a question we ask ourselves. We ask ourselves this question more in recent days and years than we used to ask ourselves, like as I look back at earlier points of my life here on the earth. We ask that question: are you ready to stand for Christ? Are you willing to stand for Christ and with the church and God's people? Would you be willing to do that in the event that circumstances so changed that it became even life-threatening to do so? There's definitely a definitive drift in that direction in the era in which we live. But a second category of people who did not prove to be helpful were those we might call who were falling prey to a love of this world. And the particular name that we see here is a name of a man named Dimas. 2 Timothy 4:9 says, "Do your best to come to me quickly, for Dimas, because he loved the world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica." It's an interesting Greek verb here for deserted. It literally means to be let down, to be set down, and that's how he felt with Dimas, deserting him. We see him listed 2 other times in the New Testament, in Philemon and in Colossians, and he's listed there simply as those who were part of Paul's group of workers and servants. But he had departed the difficult task of working for Christ in association with people that honestly the world hated, and apparently in order to return to the relative comforts of life apart from being associated with these folks and the opportunities perhaps that would provide for a more comfortable and a more sustainable life, he departed from Paul and really from apparently the faith, or at least from active service in the faith. And it says that he went to Thessalonica. Now, apparently he was originally from that town. So basically, the going got tough. The thoughts of how he could do better in life came back to him, and he basically put his tools down and went home. And you know, it really would be easier to just drift away from the faith. I mean, wouldn't it be? It'd be a lot easier. Think of what you could be doing right now. You didn't have to do this annoying thing, or didn't feel obligated or responsible out of your faith to meet together with God's people this morning. Think of the things that you could be doing on this beautiful day. You could be tailgating before the first NFL game of the season. You could maybe be getting a last trip to the beach, having gotten 8 or 10 other trips this summer to the beach. You could maybe be working extra and choose to do that on Sundays and get all the overtime and so on and make more money. But you wouldn't have to worry that way about everyone else here and feeling responsible to serve with others and so on. It is easier to pursue the world in many ways that are the ways by which we measure the comforts of life. But this is the second category that weren't helpful. Third category, those who stood in opposition to the word of truth. Actual standing in opposition. We have a man named Alexander who's mentioned here, 2 Timothy 4:14. It says, Alexander, the metalworker, did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him because he strongly opposed our message. Now, there was an Alexander who's mentioned in Acts 19 who was part of a riot that happened there before Paul's missionary journey in that place. And there's another Alexander that Timothy mentions in the first letter as Paul handing him over to Satan. And so are these the same person? I mean, it could well be and maybe is, but there are a lot of people named Alexander. It was an extremely common name. But in any event, this person would appear to be someone who was at one time a functioning, active part of the church community, likely an insider, but who had to be excommunicated at some point for teaching false doctrine, and who then in anger caused a great deal of problems, perhaps even being the person at the source of the particular problems that has Paul in jail at this juncture. But he was clearly a dangerous person due to his anger, the false teaching, and his apparent status in the community that was sufficient for him to incite uproar. You know, God doesn't seem to choose to remove and eliminate all of these people from our world and from our ministry settings. He seems to allow some people like this around, for we trust his purposes. As Paul said, there's a final day of payment for these folks, and we simply withstand it in this present world and trusting that even this God will use to bring toward greater advance for the kingdom. Fortunately, there's not a huge number of these folk. It's not extraordinarily common, but it does happen. And when it does happen, I can tell you it's terribly grievous. It leaves a person in leadership to ponder, what have we done wrong that caused this to happen? But it does happen, and it has happened from Paul's time. It's happened throughout the ages down to today. But we recognize that often these are folks with very deep problems, and not the least of which is a distance that they themselves experience, and experience the effects of a distance themselves from the Lord in personal relationship with God. So these are some of the folk who weren't helpful. They were obstacles to the cause. But we see also in Paul's writing to Timothy and Titus some other characters in the church who are a blessing to the progress of the church. Again, three categories of these. First of all, those who physically and personally were supporting the leadership personnel in their front lines ministries. An example in his writings here is a fellow named Onesiphorus. It says, 2 Timothy 1:16 and following, "May the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, when he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. May the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day," that future day. You know very well in how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. Okay, this is Paul. Paul's writing to Timothy. Where is Timothy? Timothy is in Ephesus. So Onesiphorus is then a man who was actually originally from Ephesus. He's one of these guys that exist in every church, ones who are there pretty much every time the church door opens, and one that is just kind of there sort of like, hey, what do you need? How can I help? What can I do? What do you need done today? The kind of person that is like in a role that I have, or Tim or Chris or the others, we can say, hey, can you do this? We see a need, we see something, can you connect up over here? Those kinds of people are just invaluable folks in a church. And this is what he was like, being a blessing to Paul in his time in Ephesus, being well known to Timothy as a leader there in that town and with his household. And he was not ashamed of Paul. Paul being a prisoner and an enemy of the state in confinement because of his faith and the work related to the cross. So would you want to go to Rome if you're Onesiphorus in a situation like this and search around the city and try to find out where exactly this character is who's in a dungeon somewhere, doing this in the time when the emperor in Rome is this fellow named Nero? You may have heard of him. You yourself, therefore, would be under suspicion by association. A way we could illustrate this is imagine if you were today, instead of in America, if you're a Christian in the country of Iran. What would it be like if you knew a well-known pastor in Iran who was in prison because of his faith? He's very well known around the world in Western countries. There are people petitioning the government about him, and there you are, an Iranian citizen. Do you go to Tehran? Do you go knocking around, try to find out exactly where he is so you can bring him things for his comfort and sustainability in the prison situation? Would you want to do that in that Islam-oriented religious state viewpoint that they would have toward Christ? Would you want to be seen? Would you want to be identified? That's the kind of thing that Onesiphorus did for Paul. Well, here's a second category. He's coming right back here as well in this category. Here's a second category of people who are blessing: those who show hospitality in practical ways that make ministry a viable work. We're going to talk about here about Aquila and Priscilla, but also Onesiphorus comes up again in this connection. 2 Timothy 4:19, it says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus." So, he is saying, Paul is writing, again, he's writing from where he's in prison. He's writing to Timothy in Ephesus about Onesiphorus, who was from Ephesus, who had come to where he was in Rome, had ministered to him, and now Paul is writing greetings back. Obviously, he's no longer there with Paul. He's writing greetings back to Ephesus, talking about Onesiphorus. And you get the flavor of some of this, and you get to wonder, where personally actually is this fellow? Why is he not back home? Why? Is it just not enough time? Is he like on the way and the letter through the mail beat him? Or we don't know. But perhaps he may well have been a martyr for Christ at this point. And Paul's greetings go to the family. Again, it says back a verse early, may the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day. It has a flavor, doesn't it, that he may not have actually made it. But there he is with his household, being one of those places, one of those homes, one of those family systems that serve and minister with hospitality in the church setting. Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned here. These are among my favorite characters in the New Testament. They get mentioned quite a few times in Paul's letters. They're not stars in the Christian world, but they're always nearby the people who were the stars of the Christian world, hosting them, helping them in any way that they could. They even packed their bags and traveled with Paul on his missionary, on at least one of his journeys and part of his journey, being missionaries themselves, traveling and supporting him in that. We read about how Apollos, this scholarly Harvard sort of guy, came to Christ, and who discipled him? Aquila and Priscilla were the guys who kind of pulled him aside and got him sort of straightened out and going in the right direction. And so they certainly knew the scriptures. But the early church met in people's homes. And these folks in this verse were a hospitable part of that happening. They risked their lives for the gospel, it says in Romans 16. They had often opened their homes, 1 Corinthians 16. And probably they were people of some kind of means, perhaps successful, probably successful in their business venture and so on. And so they were, again, people who said, what can I do to help? How can I help? How can I host someone? How can I show hospitality in my home, in my house, and use what I have for the Lord's work? And it's always so awesome to have people who have, again, this attitude in the church community, in the broader community of serving the church community of how can I help? How can I help today? And then in that same theme, a third category of folks that we see who are helpful are those who are helping and hosting those who travel near and far with the gospel. Missionaries and itinerant types of workers who traveled around the ancient world. It says in Titus now, chapter 3 and verse 12, As soon as I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis. So these are apparently guys who are going to take his place so that Timothy can join Paul. Or rather, Titus can join Paul. Because I have decided to winter there. So again, this is earlier than 2 Timothy's writings. This is Titus. Do everything you can to help Zenas, the lawyer, and Apollos on their way, and see that they have everything that they need. So speaking here again about hospitality, of helping people who are in the process, who are traveling through, and so on. You know, the spread of the gospel in the early church involved a wide cast of characters moving about the ancient Roman world. And how did such people support themselves? Where do they eat? Where do they sleep? Where do they stay? How do they get from place to place? And what it necessitated were another group of characters with the same vision, a spiritual family who would give of themselves and their resources to make all of this possible as people moved around the world. And in fact, it's not a great deal different today. In our own day and time, especially for missionary folks who serve the Lord around the world. We're reviving our leadership here at Team for missions ministry to have a more effective work as we support our missions cause and so on. And some of you may want to have a bigger part in this kind of ministry. Hospitality works, I'm telling you, in every day, in every age, in every millennia. I've often shared the stories of how it was very influential in my life as a boy, growing up across the road from my grandparents, who had a steady stream of missionaries and traveling speakers and seminary people and that sort of thing, who stayed and ate at my grandparents' house. And I got to meet these people and see them on a regular basis as I grew up. And it had a big impact on my life. But we ask the final question is, what kind of character do you want to be? Which of these do you want to be? Well, certainly nobody's going to say today, yes, now that you lay out those categories, I really feel that God is leading and calling me to be an obstacle to ministry. Yeah, I can do that. But really, what do we need? What do we need from folks? We need folks to just be good worker bees. Just be good worker bees. That's the great need that we have. Support others, help whatever way you can, and personal opportunities to maximize your gifts will come your way. As we talked about last week, your resources are a stewardship from God, not allowing large numbers and dollars and indicators of material success to become a root that holds you down, but rather seeing that not as a root, as we talked about last week, but rather the opportunity to invest for kingdom purposes eternally. And so you can have your resources today and you can have them pay off forever. It says in Titus 3:14, Paul says to Titus, our people must learn to devote themselves to doing what is good in order to provide for urgent needs and not live unproductive lives. So how do you live productive lives? You serve in ways to promote what is good, in ways to promote the kingdom. There's no way around it other than to see ourselves as cogs in the machine, as workers in the vineyard, as members of the same team. Kind of choose your metaphor, but you get the idea, being involved intimately in a way that is a lifestyle that leads to living what ultimately can be seen as a productive life for the kingdom. And in the end, the church and its work involves indeed a large cast of varied characters. And so we see a listing of some that were with Paul. And as we look at this final scripture, this final list, notice among this list of people that Paul sends greetings to who are part of the other miscellaneous characters out there is this fellow named Mark. John Mark. Remember who he had the previous falling out with in the missionary journeys between the first and the second journey. It was a major conflict that was there, but he speaks here warmly of Mark and of his value in ministry. 2 Timothy 4:9 and following, it says, do your best to come to me quickly. Again, for Dimas, his love in this world has deserted me, gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark, there he is, and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak I left with Carpus at Troas, and my scrolls, especially the parchments. And then we skip down a few verses, still here in 2 Timothy 4. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, household of Onesiphorus, where we talked about it. Erastus stayed in Corinth. I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you, as does Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters. So you get this list of names, this wide variety of characters, all serving and doing what God has gifted them to do. And when everyone does that, it makes a church ministry that's a workable thing, a doable thing, a successful enterprise, even in a fallen and a sinful world. And on this Sunday that we kind of remember that it's been 20 years that this church has been meeting in this 80 by 100 foot space here. And we're thinking of the people who have, I think of the people who have come and gone in this transient world in which we live, of people who are with us for a time and have moved on or grown up and gone to college and moved away or are serving in other places, and even some, sadly, though, who have honestly walked away from the Lord, just as they did in Paul and Timothy and Titus's ministries. But looking back, we can be thankful for so many who have served the Lord, who continue to serve the Lord here and around the world even. So today, what we have is today. We have this season to work and serve together, to grow and to build our families and our friends, to know God, to serve others, to reach our community and world. So let's do it. The opportunities to have impact for Christ are as good as they have ever been at any time in this age or any age. What we're doing and serving together as characters together is we're creating war stories. We really are. War stories together in kingdom warfare around us as we serve the Lord together.